planet got richer, and it got freer, and it became more working together and greater world trade and the largest middle class in the history of human beings. And in the process, we contained the Soviet Empire until it collapsed. That was the right scale. And I'm not saying that tomorrow morning but the fact that we haven't figured out probably the most important military units we could have sent into Afghanistan were military engineer battalions. If we'd mobilized every National Guard engineer battalion and rotated them in there building roads and just built as many roads as possible to make as many commercial trucks as possible in order to get people traveling back and forth to break up the isolation, we'd have done more than the last 600 tours by people who are policing. Because we're policing the same community that isn't changing. So you need vastly deeper focus on creating a modern Afghanistan of which there's a security component. It's a very different problem from Iraq. Iraq was a largely modern country with a bad dictatorship. It was the Arab country with the most women employed in public life. It was an Arab country with a huge engineering capability. It's an Arab country that had an enormous amount of oil wealth. The problems in Iraq are utterly, profoundly different from Afghanistan. And they required fundamental, but by the way, that would have required overhauling both the Defense Department, the State Department, and AID, none of whom were capable of mounting the campaign I just described. And of course, in World War II, that's what we did. We overhauled any institution we had to. That's what we did in the early days of the Cold War. That's what Reagan did again in the late days of the Cold War. Fundamental change. And it can be done. Now, the thing that most worried me when I first began speaking out about this was when the President began talking about a July 2011 withdrawal. Because I think, in the great tradition of American politicians who live in a very benign world and who are allowed to say truly dumb things on a routine basis, I mean, you know, the Vice President has established close to a world record for randomly saying things that have no meaning. Most American politicians do not understand, and this, by the way, is also what's wrong with the leak of these documents. People don't understand the consequence in a world that isn't a benign, middle-class, law-abiding society. So, when the President says, well, we ought to start withdrawing in July of 2011, the first two signals that went out were, if you're on our side, you better figure out what to do when we sell out, the Saigon complex. So don't tell me it's not possible. And if you're on their side, you figure out, how do I hang on for one more year? And that signal is instant the moment an American politician says that. And I think most of our people don't know. Similarly, I would say to you, the number one damage from the leak of all these documents is everybody on the planet learns not to trust the Americans. And I personally believe the person who leaked these documents should go to jail for the rest of their life with no parole. This is a devastating attack on the United States. And it is going to get a lot of people killed because the documents that were released had names. And they had the names of Afghans and Pakistanis who were cooperating with the United States. And think about we've done this twice before in the last 40 years, and both times, left-wing ideologues who've been prepared to break American security have caused enormous damage to our intelligence capabilities and have taught people around the planet not to cooperate with us because we are so unreliable. This is not a small thing. This isn't about freedom of the press. It's about human beings getting killed by people who are either thoughtless or who are opposed to the United States. And frankly, if you're opposed to the United States in wartime, you should lose. I'm very clear about this. And we should all be very clear about this. Now, I think that it's important to recognize then that the very act of stating a date for withdrawal has a frightening potential. It encourages our enemies to hang on, it encourages our allies to leave, and to fear that we will cut and run. And it courts a disastrous defeat, which I believe will have worldwide repercussions because of the morale effect on radical Islamists. Yet, you have to recognize that victory over radical Islamism is a long process. This will be a long struggle. This doesn't fit our model of a spasm war of 2 or 3 or 4 years. Really pay attention, get it over with. That's why I use the Cold War as one of the analogies. It took 44 years. Most of it was nonviolent, but very tense and with enormous preparation. I think that in a sense, President Bush came very close to defining this twice. First was in the Axis of Evil speech, January 29, 2002 in the State of the Union, where essentially I believe he was right, but in fact could not operationalize what he said. That is, there was an axis of evil: Iran, Iraq, North Korea. Well, we're 1 out of 3. And people ought to think about that. If Bush was right in January of 2002, and by the way, virtually the entire Congress gave him a standing ovation when he said it, then why is it that the other two parts of the axis of evil are still busily, cheerfully making nuclear weapons? And it's because we stood at the brink, looked over and thought, too big a problem. Now, if Harry Truman had done that, the world today would be communist. If Franklin Roosevelt had done that in 41, either the Japanese or the Germans would have won. If Lincoln had done that, we would have become 2 and then multiple countries. I mean, there are moments in history when you have to stand up and say, okay, tell me the size of the problem, I'll go get a solution of same size. I will overmatch the problem. That's what Americans are all about. We overmatch problems with energy, creativity, and drive. President Bush was also, I think, largely right in his second inaugural. I want to remind you what he said in January of 2005. Quote, "For as long as whole regions of the world simmer in resentment and tyranny, prone to ideologies that feed hatred and excuse murder, violence will gather and multiply in destructive power and cross the most defended borders and raise a mortal threat. There is only one force of history that can break the reign of hatred and resentment and expose the pretensions of tyrants and reward the hopes of the decent and tolerant, and that is the force of human freedom. We are led by events and common sense to one conclusion. The survival of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands. The best hope for peace in our world is the expansion of freedom in all the world." And I think President Bush, in an almost Reaganite phrase, and Callista and I were there that day, caught it just about exactly right in the second inaugural. The challenge was they needed a strategy and a system to implement a vision on this scale. And the current State Department, the current national security apparatus, and the current Defense Department are utterly incapable of that level of creativity. And that's why I think where we are today, and I think it's ironic that we are literally today, 31 years after the Ayatollah launched the first phase of the war against America. We're actually where the great leaders of World War II found themselves in 1947. And I want to take just a minute to remind you of how we did this once before, because I think it's directly relevant. This speech is not going to give you an end. The speech is the beginning. Just as we didn't figure out the entire Cold War in 1 or 2 speeches, but it took a great deal of thought and debate and argument. In February 22nd, 1946, George Kennan sends what is called the long telegram. He's the number 2 person in Moscow and the senior analyst. He says, quote, "It is clear that the main element of any United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be that of a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. It is clear that the United States cannot expect in the foreseeable future to enjoy political intimacy with the Soviet regime. It must continue to regard the Soviet regime as a rival, not a partner, in the political arena," close quote. This is February 22nd, 1946, less than a year after the end of the war, a time when we had been allies for 4 years. And here is a very senior and frankly fairly liberal member of the State Department saying, we have no choice, they're that great a threat. Harry Truman, in a series of truly historic steps, in 1947, gives a speech where we take over for the British in Greece and Turkey and launches what's called Point 4. Dean Acheson gives a tremendous speech on the importance of America filling the gap that is being left by the exhaustion of the British. And George Marshall goes to Harvard and launches the Marshall Plan to resurrect Europe and begin to reestablish our capacity to lead. Then, Truman is faced at Christmas of 1949 with an enormous decision. The Soviets have gotten an atomic bomb years earlier, warning about Iran. The Soviets have gotten an atomic bomb years earlier than the CIA thought they could, or the intelligence community back then. The CIA didn't exist for another year. Truman at Christmas makes the decision that we need to build a hydrogen bomb. Dean Acheson goes to him as Secretary of State and says, you know, if you think the world's so dangerous, we have to build a bomb whose only purpose is wiping out whole cities. Maybe we'd better design a strategy to minimize its use. And Truman said, that's a pretty logical step. And so they assigned Paul Nitze at the State Department to begin developing what became NSC 68, which is, I think, the most important single document in the Cold War. And it's a document of long-term, thoughtful preparation. He writes, quote, "The Soviet Union, unlike previous aspirants to hegemony, is animated by a new fanatic faith antithetical to our own and seeks to impose its absolute authority over the rest of the world. Conflict has therefore become endemic and is waged on the part of the Soviet Union by violent or non-violent methods in accordance with the dictates of expediency. The whole success of the proposed program hangs ultimately on recognition by this government, the American people, and all free peoples that the Cold War is in fact a real war in which the survival of the free world is at stake. Essential prerequisites to success are consultations with congressional leaders designed to make the program the object of nonpartisan legislative support and a presentation to the public of a full explanation of the facts and implications of the present international situation. The prosecution of the program will require of us all the ingenuity, sacrifice, and unity demanded by the vital importance of the issue, and the tenacity to persevere until our national objectives have been attained." Issued by Harry Truman, April 14, 1950. In 1991 at Christmas, the Soviet Union disappears. Despite Democrat or Republican, despite all sorts of problems, we sustain, for longer than a generation, the forces of freedom to contain the forces of tyranny. Now, I believe we have to understand that the struggle, military, political, societal, economic, cultural, intellectual, with radical Islamists may well last several generations, may well last longer than the Cold War, because it's a much more fundamental, I think much more difficult struggle, requiring far more change. But I think that there are key moments in history that we've frankly lived through before. We understand how to do this. And if you'll bear with me for just a moment or two more, I want to place in context where we are, to remind us that we're Americans, that we've been here before, and we've been here in harder times. I wrote a book with Bill Fortune called To Try Men's Souls, which is about Washington crossing the Delaware, when his army had declined to 2,500 men, of whom one-third did not have boots. They marched 9 miles in the snow and ice, leaving a trail of blood with their feet wrapped in burlap bags. They marched all night in a snowstorm so intense that the Germans at Trenton did not put out any guards. And they marched having crossed an icy river in the middle of the night during the snowstorm. Their password that night was victory or death. As they got on the boats that night to cross the river, Washington, who had requested Thomas Paine to write a new pamphlet, had his officers read the following, which had originally been published on December 23rd and is being read on the night of December 25th. The pamphlet itself is worth your reading, but this is the opening paragraph. "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." Now, that small band won a victory. The victory raised the morale of the Americans, and 2 weeks later Washington had 15,000 volunteers and drove the British across northern New Jersey, and the revolution was preserved to fight on. Washington spent 8 years in the field with 1 week at home in Mount Vernon. That's what freedom was worth to Washington. Period, a few years later, actually captured as 7 years after Washington crossed the Delaware, Lincoln said the following, in probably the most famous short speech in American history, at Gettysburg, dedicating the National Military Cemetery, having written "under God" into his speech while sitting looking out over the cemetery, which makes, frankly, the Ninth Circuit Court decision in 2002 so infuriatingly anti-American. "It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great tasks remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause